As you work with assemblies, you'll encounter situations where constraint errors occur. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the different types of errors you might encounter. There are three primary causes for constraint errors. You add a constraint that causes a conflict. You change a part and the constraint geometry is lost. Or you replace a component and the constraints don't work. Even though constraints are usually okay unless you make a change that causes a problem, it's unlikely that you'll build an assembly where you don't run into one or two failed constraints. When you work with large assemblies with hundreds or even thousands of constraints, especially if you collaborate with others, you're sure to encounter plenty of constraint errors, so it's important to be able to identify and troubleshoot them. When an assembly has a constraint error, you'll see the red cross on the title bar. The red cross displays whenever there is a problem in a part or assembly. When I click on the red cross, the Design Doctor dialog displays. The constraint error is listed in the field, and the description for this error is Mate 6, Constraint with Undefined Geometry. The components and the constraint geometry are highlighted in the graphics window. I'll expand the lever in the browser so you can see the constraint that's marked with the error glyph. Let's look at the constraint information so we can get some clues about why it failed. The constraint has an axiomate icon, so the selections were entities like work axes, holes, cylinders, or cones. Inventor displays the component names after the constraint, and the first selection was on the ratchet, and the second selection was on the lever. I'll click the Next button on the Design Doctor dialog. That page gives a description of the constraint problem. I'll click Next again, and there are several options for working with the SIC constraint. I'll select Isolate and Edit Constraint and click Finish. This turns off the visibility of the rest of the components in the assembly and edits the constraint. The second selection button is active, which means the geometry on the lever is missing. There are several reasons why a constraint entity may go missing, but it usually occurs if the entity is deleted or if another feature removes the entity. In this case, the constraint was probably placed to geometry that changed, or a work axis that was deleted. I'll cancel out of the constraint dialog, and then I'll right-click on the ratchet and select Undo Isolate. Then return to the home view. A more common type of constraint error occurs when a constraint is redundant or over-defining the assembly. Constraints are used to position components, and a redundancy occurs when a constraint removes the same degrees of freedom as another constraint, or if the component is grounded. I'll show you how a grounded component can have a redundant constraint. The ratchet handle was automatically grounded because it was the first component placed in the assembly, but there aren't any constraints between it and the assembly origin. I'll right-click on the handle and turn off grounded. And then I'll go to the Productivity group and click on the Ground and Root Component command. This adds flush constraints between the part and assembly origin planes and grounds the part again. A grounded part can't move in the assembly, so the flush constraints are redundant. Even if the redundant constraints don't cause a conflict, the constraint solver still has to analyze them, which can cause performance issues when you work with large assemblies. Another problem is that redundant constraints can be ticking time bombs. I want to change the distance between the ratchet and the wheel, so I'll click on the axiomate constraint. Change the value to 0.781 and press Enter, which causes a conflict. It can take a lot of time to track down and fix a constraint error that's caused by a redundant constraint. In this case, it makes sense to have a constraint for the distance between the parts, so I don't want to delete it to remove the error. As a result, I have to dig into the assembly and figure out why the problem occurred. Now that you have an idea of what causes constraint errors and how you can view the errors, in the next few lessons we'll take a look at how to resolve them.